Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Buddy is trying to say hi, but he's also twitchy, so he might pop in. Um, my name is Stephanie Bree, and today we're talking about 90s, quote, extreme culture. So, starting in the late 80s, I would say around 87 on, uh, Ninja Turtles hit the scene, and you got the influx of the skateboarding culture and the surfer dude culture, which merged to form the 90s extreme culture. So you started off with the stereotypical dude, cowabunga, righteous, etc., all that bullshit. That was just like the vernacular, the slang kids were picking up on, mostly from Ninja Turtles, but other sources. And you had in the mid to late 80s, 85, 86, 87, you had a big influx of like neon culture. Neon lights, bright neon colors. Kids were wearing neon t-shirts and ball caps. Everything was bright neon for a few years. And then around the turn of the decade, around 90, 91, with the rise of grunge culture, we shifted. Things went to more like the dirty, ripped jeans, the dirty t-shirts, the flannel, shirt over the top of your t-shirt, the sideways ball cap, things like that. But the marketing that was targeting children really embraced the loud extreme culture. So television commercials, the announcers got louder in volume in their voice, and they talked faster. We started some of this in the late 80s with John Machida Jr. doing the Micro Machine commercials. That carried on into the 90s with Zack Attack, the Lego Maniac, and shit like that. Even Nintendo embraced it with the Super NES on Super Mario Brothers. The hidden levels are all called Spectacular and Tubular and Righteous and stuff like that. So even Nintendo got in on the... Not only that, but also their commercials had like fast MTV cuts and a lot of quick camera movements and kids on skateboards and weird stuff. And the tagline was "Play it loud." The basic gist was the 90s were like, everything has to be more extreme. Partially because the 80s were already fucking coked out to begin with, so everything was already extreme in the 80s. Because you had the punk rock, and you had the frizzy hair, and the slap bracelets and all that shit. So the 90s were kind of, one, coming down from the coke high, but also, hey, if you can be at a 10, we can be at an 11. In 90, the kids my age who were born in the 80s but shifted to adolescence in the 90s, at the time, we didn't embrace the 80s like our older counterparts did. We rejected the 80s at the time, full stop. We were like, no, the 80s, that's like, ew, gross. That's mom's stuff. We wanted 90s stuff. We wanted Ninja Turtles. We wanted Street Sharks. Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter. We didn't want fucking He-Man or G.I. Joe anymore. We were like over it. Which is why G.I. Joe was rebranded G.I. Joe Extreme. Ghostbusters was rebranded Extreme Ghostbusters and stuff like that. They were more muscular, more beefier. They had the backwards hats. They had the flannel shirt with the leather vest and like the fucking Nike shoes and shit like that, because everything had to be more, like I said, quote, extreme. This eventually, in the mid-90s, led to the creation of what we called the X Games, which was short for Extreme Games, where you started to see a more mainstream legitimacy of fringe stuff like skateboarding and rollerblading and hacky sack and frisbee golf and all that weird stuff that I don't know where it fucking came from, but all of a sudden it was just like fucking everywhere. And for like part of a year, like hacky sack was it. Everybody had to have a hacky sack, and you had to be good at hacky sack, or you were basically a ghost. If you couldn't hacky sack, you were a ghost. Which is kind of weird. But in the 90s, they sort of went beyond the bright neon colors of the 80s and went to more of a, I would say, brighter, I'll use the term Nickelodeon colors. You had like the lime green and the bright pink. It wasn't the neon shades, it was just like brighter shades. Which contrasted with the muter grays and dark reds and oranges of like the neon and the flannel and the sweater vests, which were inexplicably popular in the 90s. Don't look at people's yearbook photos from the 90s, because you're going to see them in a sweater vest and you're going to want to vomit. It's disrespectful to do that to people. Music got more extreme in the 90s. You know, once the dust settled of the grunge movement and we got into the what they called post-grunge, you had the rise of gangster rap, but you also had the rise of like industrial metal. You had stuff like Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson, Rob Zombie. Eventually you got into Limp Bizkit and stuff like that. Which was like, it took the more traditional rock music and amped it up with more punk rock, grunge rock aesthetic and, aspirations, I'll say. But like blended it with like the hip hop scene, and the skater punk and the surfer dude scene. All just sort of blobbing together into this weird mishmash of bullshit. It's really hard to explain if you weren't there. Which I think is one of the reasons why nobody is like clamoring to recreate the 90s aesthetic as much as we are the 80s aesthetic, because the 80s had a more original aesthetic than the 90s. The 90s, for all their, quote, extreme, a lot of it was just basically ripping off the 70s. A lot of it was just like, oh yeah, let's just go back to the 70s, but with a touch of 80s. And it was really weird. The jean jackets were no longer cool. The ripped jeans were no longer cool. T-shirts had to have logos on them. You couldn't just have a t-shirt. It had to have a logo of a band, and it had to be the right band. You couldn't have the wrong band t-shirt, or else you would get, beat up or picked on, or have, green beans thrown at you during lunch. So you had to make sure your band t-shirt was the correct band. So, at the time, the quote-unquote correct band, you could wear band t-shirts of like, Nine Inch Nails or Marilyn Manson or, Green Day. Those were considered socially acceptable. But if you wore a t-shirt of like Hootie and the Blowfish, you got a bloody nose by the end of the day. The so-called extreme era of the 90s, similarly to the grunge era of the 90s, was actually relatively short-lived compared to the decade as a whole. Grunge, realistically, was like 90 to 92, and then it faded away. The extreme era was like 89 to 93. It overlapped with grunge, but it lasted a little longer. And then by like 94 on, we were sort of past the extreme era, and we were into what they refer to as the Attitude Era. And I don't just mean the WWF, WCW Attitude Era. I mean the Tude Era. The Sonic the Hedgehog, Booger Man, Earthworm Jim, you know, your video game mascots had to have an attitude. They had to be, quote, cool. You couldn't just, you know, Mario was popular with the Mario crowd, but like the cool kids were into like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or, you know, eventually Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, or, you know, Final Fantasy. You had the steampunk with Final Fantasy 7. Or, I mean, Cyberpunk. Final Fantasy 3, aka 6, was steampunk. 7 was cyberpunk, but I get those terms mixed up. But anyways, you had this new... Also, you had this... The arrival, I will say, mainstream arrival of anime influxed into American culture. So that also brought about bright colors and, you know, again, more extreme hairdos. You know, the spiky hair, the frosted tips, and stuff like that. Again, a lot of it's a blur because this is like fucking 30 years ago. I'm going based on what I remember, but also what I've like seen documented in other YouTube videos and documentaries and just rewatching old TV shows from the time. But really, the extreme era of the 90s was youth culture. The adults, they didn't know, they weren't in tune to it at all. So if you're watching like adult-oriented TV shows like, you know, Friends or Seinfeld, or, you know, Roseanne, Home Improvement, what are some other shows from that period? Frasier, stuff like that. You would have had no clue that the extreme culture was a thing in the 90s. You wouldn't have been in tune to it at all. You had to be watching MTV or Nickelodeon or Saturday morning cartoons in order to understand what the extreme culture was. And even though it primarily originated with the rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, even the Ninja Turtles themselves had to dial it up and become even more extreme towards the middle of the 90s, because they were no longer the dominant force in kids' lives. They had to compete with Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which was even more extreme than Ninja Turtles. And yes, this is why you had Power Rangers, you know, windsurfing out of an airplane at the start of the movie, landing on the concrete and then rollerblading through town. Because that's what kids wanted in the 90s. You had to move fast, and it had to be like, you know, crazy shit. You know? Yeah, you couldn't just skateboard anymore. It wasn't enough. You had to Tony Hawk's style skateboard. You had to do tricks. You couldn't just jump on a board and, you know, ride it down the street. Or, you know, jump the ramp. You had to do ollies and all this other stuff. It wasn't just enough to be able to rollerblade. You had to be able to jump on your rollerblades. You know, both knees in the air. You had to be able to jump over the rails. Stuff like that. Bicycling got replaced by BMX biking. BMX bikes were more, you know, they were your standard children's bicycle, but like amped up to be more like they had like modifications to be more like a dirt bike. So it was like a dirt bike. Basically, your BMX bike was a dirt bike without a motor. Basically is what it was. And they were all the fucking rage. If you had a bicycle in the mid to late 90s, it had to be a BMX style bike. You couldn't be riding a mountain bike or a traditional bicycle anymore. And the trading card in the wheel, the bubblegum wrappers, the fucking little honk the horn, the little tinsels and that shit, tassels and that kind of stuff, that was no longer acceptable. That was like, no, that was like old. Don't do that anymore. That was the uncool stuff. you had to have stickers on everything, and they had to be like skulls and crossbones, or they had to be electric guitars, or lightning symbols, or, you know, flames, or zombies, or, you know, just horror stuff. You know, it had to be something. It had to be something, like I said, you know, I'm overusing the word extreme, but that's the whole point of this video. It had to be something like that, you know. Now, ironically enough, the 90s youth-focused horror movie scene never embraced the extreme attitude era. Never did. The horror movies in the 90s were way more subdued compared to their 80s counterparts. Which is really weird. Because even by 96, when Scream came on the scene to, like, commentate on horror, people were like, oh yeah, shit. Horror isn't as extreme as, like, MTV and Nickelodeon and Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers and stuff. What the hell? It was really weird. You know, video games had embraced the Attitude Era. Cartoons and music videos embraced the Attitude Era. But horror movies never did. Neither did action movies. Action movies, and I'm using air quotes, action movies in the 90s were very subdued compared to the 80s, or even compared to what came later. You know, you started to get stuff like Blade and The Fifth Element and Matrix, and then from there on, action movies became more in line with the extreme era of the 90s. But like the early 90s, you had like weird pseudo-action movies like Executive Decision and Patriot Games and The Rock and Bad Boys and all this weird stuff that was so tame compared to the action movies of the 80s, and very tame compared to action movies of today. And I don't mean tame in terms of content or themes, because they were still very adult-themed movies. I mean tame in terms of, you know, they didn't have as many explosions and car chases and martial arts scenes and fast cuts and quick edits and that stuff that we've become, you know, used to over the last couple of decades. In the 90s, it was a lot more, again, subdued. Which, again, is kind of counter to the youth culture. The adults didn't get the memo. You know what I'm saying? Like, the movies and TV shows and music aimed at adults was still like, hey, remember the 80s? Yeah, wasn't that fun? But the shit that was targeting to kids was like, ew, gross, the 80s. No, we want new stuff. And it really wasn't until after 9/11 that a lot of people in my generation, the millennials, like, reverted to the 80s. Because 9/11 was jarring for us. Because most millennials were like late teens, early 20s when 9/11 happened. I was 18 when it happened. So it was like, at the time where we were becoming adults and getting our worldview, the shit hit the fan and we were like, God damn it, now we really have to grow up. And we didn't want to grow up. So we're like, when was the last time we felt safe? Oh yeah, the 80s when we were little kids. And I think that's culturally why we, the millennials, reverted to the 80s and latched onto it, and then just sort of dismissed the 90s because we associated the 90s with 9/11 because it happened right after the end of the 90s. But the 80s were far enough removed. We'd be like, yeah, Ghostbusters, Short Circuit, Nightmare on Elm Street. That's far enough removed from 9/11. We feel safe again. So we just sort of latched onto, and I would say became excessively obsessed with the 80s as a culture. And I'm still going to blame it on 9/11 because I saw it happen. You can go back and watch the movies and video games and cartoons, and you can see the turning point where we went from moving forward to, yeah, let's just stay in the 80s for eternity. Anyways, that's all I have to say about the 90s extreme culture.